All right. So a little bit of background context here. As you all know, LLMs and GPT have taken the world by storm over the past couple of months, and it's been longer than that, but it's really been in the mainstream for the past couple of months. And JibJab had an initiative um, over the past quarter, which was we wanted to replace our older legacy admin to help our customer service team and others manage users, upload content, manage a lot of the things on our applications. So I figured this was a great opportunity to kind of prototype a new admin build out with some new modern frameworks and technologies, as well as really get my hands dirty with GPT, figure out what it can and can't do. As you all know, there's a lot of sensationalism out there, YouTube, Twitter, people saying like software engineering's dead, this, that, and the other thing. What's actually the case? So I wanted to kind of dig in and see what it was actually capable of. And I'll go over that journey here. And as you'll see, and John mentioned earlier, there's definitely some good, bad, and the ugly with this technology. So a little bit of a disclaimer. I know how to code, but for the purposes of this experiment, my goal is to code basically as little as possible. So I'm just going to continue to reprompt it until I can get the answer that I need instead of actually going in and refactoring or digging in deeper until I absolutely need to. So I've never used React Admin before. I know the basics of React, and I'm probably enough to be dangerous with JavaScript. So that's kind of where my skill set is at the moment. All right. So I started out with GPT 3.5, and this was around back in April. So this has been a several month project on and off. But I started recording this stuff around back in April. So I just asked it very simply, what's a good framework to build an admin in React.js? And one of the first ones, and I kind of knew this is where I wanted to go, was the React admin framework. So I just said, let's get started. And it gave me some pretty basic steps that you would find on pretty much any tutorial, the npm commands, the basic import statements, and the basic kind of foundation and framework of the application. So I went and did this in my terminal, and I was getting errors already off the bat. So apparently I had run create React app, I guess years ago, and I had an old version running on my machine, and it was not properly upgrading with the commands that GPT wanted me to use. So, instead of searching Google and everything like that, I just went to GPT to try to resolve my issues here. So I told it the exact error I was facing, and it tried to give me some solutions. And it got me out of trouble. So I was able to correctly ask GPT, just basically paste in what the error was, and it told me how to upgrade to the latest. So that was quite nice. Didn't have to leave the actual ChatGPT tab. So, you know, I just asked it very simply, how do I debug an app within VS Code within Chrome? It's not necessarily as easy as like Xcode, where you just launch your application and the debugger is already inherently linked. You do have to do a couple of extra steps, such as this launch JSON file. I had forgotten kind of how to set that up properly, so asked it, and it gave me the simple steps to do it. So finally, the moment of truth. We have the foundational code. We can debug it. Let's load it. And I started it up, but everything is empty. So no users are showing, and that's part of what the admin should be doing is showing some users. So I just told it I don't see a list of users in the My React admin app. And it gave me some potential solutions, but this is very generic. This is not telling me what code to write. This is basically something Stack Overflow might tell me. If I go on Stack Overflow and type in this query, I might get a checklist like this of things to look into. But my goal here is not to really read any docs. It's not to write any code. I want GPT to do all this for me and see how far we can take it. So I asked what a list guesser was. It told me to use one of those things. I don't know what that is. So it gave me a sample with a little description. That was pretty nice. So I can kind of infer what that is now. It's basically taking all of the properties inside of a payload and doing its best guess to pick if it's a text field, a Boolean, an integer, whatever that is, and display it simply on a page. So still nothing's really quite linking up. So again, I kind of reprompted it, helped me build a simple React admin page that displays a list of users. This is a pretty simple query that if I asked a software engineer or a senior software engineer, I think they would pretty much understand it. They'd probably have some questions about what does the payload look like? What's the API, things like that. But overall, I think this is a fairly straightforward prompt. Um, and it was too generic. So I then got pretty specific. So I need to return data from an API. The API looks like this. These are the query string parameters that this API can have. So I got very specific now to hopefully have it be able to walk me through some actual code to write. So some of the code that it gave me, it started providing some things I didn't ask for. So it started implementing sorting, and it started trying to put those sort parameters within the query string even though I didn't ask for it. And that led to some issues. I also let it know that I forgot to add an authorization token to the request because this is a protected endpoint. So it helped me with that as well. All right. So, moment of truth. I asked it, it gave it some specifics, told it I needed a protected API. What happened? I got an error right away. So, this didn't help. Let's kind of see what happened. And as you all know, when you get those error messages, this is where the real fun starts. So it keeps giving me these solutions in a vacuum. As I give it errors, it's not using my previous context to actually give me a correct answer. It's giving me these generic like Stack Overflow kind of answers, and this is likely how it's giving me these responses. So not really helpful for someone who wants to just code. Who wants to just have GPT code for it. You definitely need to have some knowledge if you're going to use GPT 3.5 in particular. Um, and then I asked specifically, can you provide this fix to the previous message? And it gave an attempt to actually embed its suggested answer into the code example it gave me earlier. But it's a bit of a struggle here. I kept trying, but with each bug fix, it was almost as if it was giving me that bug fix in the context of a brand new tutorial. So it's like it was giving me answers based on 3 or 4 different tutorials it was trained on. So each time the code was framed differently, was architected a little bit differently. It didn't quite fit with with the project we were building together. So this continued on and on and on, and I kept telling it about errors I was running into. That's not the same code you gave me before. Let's just start over. Given the previous code, can we make this work? Let's start over again. Error, 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 error. We did not get far at all with GPT 3.5 when I tried to play dumb and just have it write all my code for me. So couldn't get it started. Felt like it was forgetting my previous prompts, but it was impressive to take a lot of what I needed and give me some sort of foundation. So it got somewhere, but really not anywhere. And I probably burned around 2 to 3 hours kind of just experimenting with 3.5, seeing what it could and couldn't do. And again, didn't get very far. So my consensus is 3.5 cannot build you an admin on its own. So let's upgrade to the real star of the show here, GPT-4, and let's see what everyone's talking about in terms of these noticeable differences. Did I see is that a hand raise?
Yes, I have a question. Sorry.
Sure.
You were interacting a lot. I typed in the chat. I just didn't know if you saw it. You were interacting a lot with 3.5. The context window, I don't know off the top of my head. It's not super big. And so when you go out of the context window, it doesn't remember anything else, right? That's how the chat interface works. So the idea of it starting over kind of makes sense if the amount of text you send it is consistently large given the context window. Did you think about that limitation when you were doing this, or is just like, I'm going to pretend I'm totally naive, I have no idea how it works, pretend the chat has infinite history, and away you go?
At the time, I did not think about it. This came up in GPT-4 for sure, as the context is much larger in GPT-4, and I got very far with GPT-4, and then I noticed it started forgetting what we were working on, like an hour or two into the project, and that's when it kind of clicked for me that context was an issue and something to consider. I think 3.5 just I don't know if it's a context issue or a raw capability issue, but you'll see in some of these examples, it's just night and day in terms of what it can provide for you, 4 versus 3.5. And
Gotcha.
hopefully,
Thank you.
the next couple slides will kind of illustrate some of that difference for you. Anybody else before we jump into GPT-4? All right. So on the heels of some frustration and disappointment with 3.5, we decided to pay the piper and get into GPT-4 and see what this is capable of. So very similar query to before. With React Admin, I would like a page that shows a search bar, a drop-down menu, and a list of users. The list of users will be populated from the query in the search bar. here's the API call, here's the query string params, and here's what a sample payload would look like, a sample response would look like. A little bit more of a detailed request than the 3.5 example, but I tried to make it a little more robust, so hopefully it would be able to do it in one shot. So right off the bat, I noticed immediately its response was far more detailed. So it was a little more hand holding, and it started actually writing code that I would expect an engineer to actually write. It starts separating files, it starts separating concerns, and giving a little bit more detail. So it's saying create a specific file user list, define custom actions, define a data provider file, define a user list file with a specific data grid. And it didn't finish the response, and now it has a regenerate or a continue function or something like that, like a button that'll have it continue what it's doing. But it didn't quite finish its response. Had it finish no problem. So all this is great. It's already looking much better, and now it's actually producing code I would expect an engineer to write. And then finally, finish it off with adding this to your main app.js file, with which, if you're familiar with React, is kind of the starting point, the foundation of the entryway into the React application. But unfortunately, compiled with problems again, so didn't quite make it all the way. But the big difference here was I told it I got an error that data provider was undefined, and it actually provided a solution with the context of the code it had provided me earlier. So this actually gave me a place to just copy and paste and insert into Visual Studio. No problem. I didn't have to, I read it, but I didn't have to. I could just copy and paste this and actually drop it into Visual Studio, and it was working within the same exact code. It did not give me new code. It modified the existing code we were already working with. But again, unfortunately, hit compilation problems again. So we're not quite there yet. So, I'm kind of a little disappointed again. This is still back in April when this is all very, very new at the time. And again, we go through the kind of song and dance I went through with 3.5. I received this specific error. Apologies for the confusion. This is how you fix that. Now I received this error. Now I received that error. Now I get that error. I reverted back. Let's try it again. Does React have a form component? Now it's kind of bringing me down the wrong path. I got another error. I think we can revert that. I got another error. The website doesn't run. Error, error, error. This goes on for probably about 10, 15 minutes. So we got stuck again. So very disappointed. Again, maybe this isn't so possible. Maybe it's a lot of just sensationalism on Twitter and YouTube. Maybe these guys are wrong. Maybe you can't really do this. I'm not quite sure, but not ready to give up. There's got to be a path. So I just started over, reprompted, made the prompt a little bit better, a little bit more specific, and boom. So just reprompting, now I have an admin. The users aren't showing up, but now I don't have errors anymore. So, but what happened? I went and looked back, and really the only difference in the code, the only major difference was this header property. The old admin was trying to use this top toolbar, and the new one was using this filter property here, this filter component. And really, that's it. So what happened was it seems like GPT-4 can be pretty stubborn. So it was trying to debug and get its way out of trouble by brute forcing solutions with this incorrect component here. And the real component React admin would like you to use, or at least that works better, it is a little bit opinionated, this sort of framework, is this filter. Everything works really well within a filter component. So I also knew something was off. It kept trying to introduce Material UI, but I know React admin uses that under the hood. It just kept trying to brute force its way through this incorrect solution. So this is where I noticed if you have some of that domain knowledge and you're able to see that while you're working with GPT-4, you can back out of trouble much sooner and much quicker and get on with it. So someone who does not have any sort of expertise might get stuck, and they might get stuck for a long time. So time spent 2 hours here, going back and forth with errors, just learning how the framework works, how the prompting works, about 2 hours. But I can feel it now. I feel like now we're getting somewhere. So let's see if we can hook it up to our actual API. So we use JSON API standardization at JibJab. So I wanted to convert the payload I'd given it before and make sure it could read and parse JSON API. And it suggested importing this package that can help with that. So it's still not making the API call properly, but I feel like it got pretty close. So I took a deeper look, And this is where I actually had to break out the debugger a little bit. So I, set some breakpoints and looked at the exact query it was requesting and the exact request it was getting back, if anything at all. And I had noticed that it was building the query string improperly here. So this is where I could actually prompt it and tell it specifically what it's doing wrong. So this is where having an engineering background, a coding background is going to get you unstuck quickly and back moving. So I gave it specific instructions, but still no luck. And I said, no, you're still doing it quite a little bit wrong. You're getting closer, but you still have some of these query strings wrong. And I'm highlighting those in red, kind of where the query string is actually incorrect. And then it did give me a correct answer over on the right. So once, after the second prompt of me specifically telling it what it was doing wrong, instead of me going and fixing the code myself, it was able to produce properly working code that is completely hooked up to our real APIs and doing real searches and showing real data in our admin now. So we've actually gotten somewhere, which is great. Writing no code myself. I have not actually touched the keyboard in terms of coding. I've only set breakpoints and read data at this point. And paging works as well. So able to page through this whole result set and do a partial search as well, just for the search term M. All right. Any questions before we continue on?
Is
Cool.
there a
All
happy
right.
ending here?
Yes. So I let it know I slightly, so at this point, I just refactored the file a little bit. It was getting a little messy. So I just let it know I had refactored it and so it could put that in its context and work within what I had changed. So that's important too. If you're going to change the file at all, let it know, because if you ask it to build upon it, it's going to build it upon it with the context it had. So it's nice to have it work. And I'm assuming in the future, this will be right inside of your IDE with Copilot when it starts using 4. That'll all be internal, and you won't have to leave your IDE at all. So now I want it to actually start selecting a row so it can start showing more details about users. So I let it know what the specific API call is to get a specific user. And boom, it showed me I need to build this user show component. I need to add a resource to the app.js. I need to add a show button, and I need to add a user filter component to be able to actually filter users. But I clicked on a row and nothing was happening yet. So I let it know that. And it said very simply, we forgot to add the data provider. So it forgot a very critical component of the whole chain of how React admin works. And it very simply just said, add this function to the get one method of data provider, which makes sense. And we were able to click on the show button, and we're actually now able to see an individual user now. But I let it know, I click on a row and it works. It doesn't work. And I click on show button and it does work. So I told it that, and it said, just add the row click property. And this is where I noticed like it's giving me very verbose responses, which is nice for copying and pasting the code. But really the only difference in the code was just this green box when I told it what was missing. And now everything is hooked up. I can click on a row. I can click on the button. I can see the individual users, no problem. So only 1 hour here, not too bad. Now we're starting to actually pick up the pace. So it took a little bit of refactoring. I didn't define my requirements clearly. So if I had done that initially, I think everything would have hooked up perfectly. And there were times where I had to set breakpoints to actually give GPT intimate knowledge of what was going wrong. All right, so I took a break. I was actually working on other stuff, and I came back 3 weeks later. So what happened? I want to add makes. So makes are at JibJab what we call the finished product of what a user would make when they share an e-card with somebody. We call that a make. So I want to continue with the project we were working on. When clicking on a specific user, I want to display a one-to-many relationships where a user can have several makes. Again, here's the API call. Here's a sample payload. So assuming your data provider is set up correctly, you could display the user's makes within the user show component like so. So it forgot what we were working on. I didn't change anything in the prompting window, but 3 weeks had passed and it did forget what I was working on, even when I reloaded the conversation. So I don't know if that's a bug or if that's intended, but this is what happened to me. So I did have to reacclimate it with what was done. So basically what I did is I pasted in my entire data provider again, just so GPT was aware of it again. So it just said, I need to know more about your current data provider. So I just copied it all into the window. So it got refamiliarized with it again. So at this point, said you should probably add a get list request and use the reference many field, and this will help you with showing a one-to-many relationship within a one-to-one context. So when loading user show, I got the error. I told it about the error I got, and it said, fix up your get many reference function. So it provided me a solution, and it noticed that this JSON API call did not have a meta field for the total. So it started, I let it know. I said, I'm using JSON API, not REST API. So that's when it said, this is how you can correctly calculate the total. And you could see that variable here in the bottom right. So React Admin does need a total for paging. And the way JSON API works is it doesn't give you a total. It gives you next, previous, last, kind of links like that for the actual endpoints. So once I did that, once it knew we were actually using JSON API, which I had to kind of remind it, it was able to correctly now show me a list of makes within a specific user's window. So, these are e-cards that this user had made. And now, looks ugly, but we're actually seeing the data. We can go pretty it up later, no problem. All right, so that was only 25 minutes. So that wasn't bad at all. Now we're really, really making progress here. And I actually did this in between meetings. So I had a 30-minute gap in between a meeting, which normally I would never try to do something like this. And I said, let's just prompt GPT and see how far we can get. And I was able to get this completely working in between meetings, which was great. So I had to reprompt a couple things. But again, if you can keep your prompts focused and directed, it's extremely powerful. So last, let's add the head images. So as an admin, we need to know what heads a user used inside of those makes. So I let it know I want to display a horizontal list of heads within each one of those make rows that we just built. The head images are found with the sample response I posted earlier and are within the included array, which you should be familiar with if you've used JSON API, where the type is admin/heads. Here we go. So loaded it up, no images. So what I told it is I did some debugging and I said, the record variable that is typically populated with data is not showing data in this context. It's very weird. And again, nothing. So we went back and forth a couple times. And it was when I said, here are the actual properties that I'm passing in. And this is where I looked at this bullet in particular. It said, ensure the version of React Admin is using version 3.0. And we're not using 3.0, we're using 4.0. So this suggests to me that it's giving me solutions from a 2021 version of the actual SDK. So that's where it popped into my head. Well, let me go look at how to actually, did this change with 4.0? It is a major version. Maybe something changed. So I actually went and looked at the documentation very quickly, and it said, no, you can't pass, record is not naturally passed in as a JavaScript property anymore with 4.0. You have to actually fetch it with this hook called use record context. So once I told it that, it seemed to know weirdly, or maybe it was just hallucinating that it knows. But when I told it this is how you actually get the record, it said, yeah, that makes sense to me using this, which is part of the React Admin framework. With React Admin v4, I apologize for the confusion I caused earlier, and it gave me the correct code using this new solution that I found in the React Admin documentation. So it was trying to give me a 3.0 solution. I'm on 4.0. We had to kind of change one thing that they refactored in the framework. Doesn't come in as a property anymore like everything else we used. If you want to build your own custom component, which is what this head component is on the right, this is not a React Admin component. This is a custom one we built. You have to use the hook, use record context to actually get the record property. So you can see on the right, heads are now displaying. Everything's working. This only took 20 minutes, but this was really just me looking through documentation. This was not going back and forth with GPT. So now I'm getting much more comfortable with GPT and things are moving quite well. So some unexpected hang up with V4 versus V3. Everything was in place. I believe if I was on actually V3, this would have snapped right into place and I probably would have been done in 2 to 3 minutes. But again, someone could have gotten very stuck here if you didn't know or didn't think to look at the version changes. You might have gotten stuck here for a very long time. I don't know how long. You could see earlier how you can get stuck if you don't know how to back up and escape to, internet documentation, whatever it is. So some final thoughts of what I think and what I've learned in this little project, and I've worked with a lot more. My team is working with GPT every day, Copilot as well. Um, it's completely mind blowing, like that I can just tell it what I want as if like I'm a product manager and I'm working with like a software engineer. The fact that it can like use previous context, know what I'm trying to ask it, refactor the code that it wrote earlier, and actually give me working solutions is just mind boggling to me. But it's true. If you can actually prompt it correctly, it's going to get you very far. But it can get stuck and it might at times try to brute force its way out instead of backing up and trying a different approach like a software engineer would do. Once a software engineer hits that diminishing returns, they might back up and try a different approach. GPT didn't seem to do that. It kept trying to just push through. I think it might open up some more flow time intervals. Like I said earlier, I was able to actually make progress in between two meetings. And that is a big problem with engineers and getting some good flow time and flow state. So maybe it could open up some more intervals there. I now think I know quite a bit about React Admin just by looking at GPT results in GPT code. I think I know like a decent amount about React Admin. Not an expert, but I know it needs a data provider. I know the components work and how the whole chain kind of connects together. If you have solid foundational knowledge about the framework you're working with, you're going to fly. So if you're a React expert, you've used React Admin in the past, you're going to fly with this tool. You probably could have done everything I did in under an hour, maybe less. Be careful with the prompt lengths. As John mentioned earlier, this is where I noticed that as we got pretty far in our project, it was starting to forget what I worked on earlier. And I was posting it extremely verbose prompts where I would put in like the entire request, the entire response. And this JSON was hundreds of lines long. I then started trimming it and putting, dot, dot, dot before and after and just giving it the key context of what I actually wanted it to look for. So be careful with the length of your prompts. Don't just blindly copy paste everything in. The shorter, the better. So you can keep that context going as long as possible. It's going to help with the prompt chaining. But after I got the foundation up and running, there were times later in the project where I actually wanted to go and write the code myself. It was actually just easier because it was just slight modifications of what we had written earlier. So I noticed that it was great at building something new and great at building a proof of concept and maybe refactoring something. And it could do that all on its own initially, but after that, it kind of became an assistant for me. I would ask it for some one-off things, or I would ask it to help me, like what I'm going to add in the future to this admin, maybe this week, is, hey, I want to add a login page where once the user types in a username and a password, they get an authorization token, and we store that in local storage, right? And then we'll use that variable for the future protected APIs. I'll probably prompt it entirely to help me build that. But after that, if I go and extend the user page, for example, something we've already built before, I might just write that code myself just because it's probably quicker at that point because the foundation's already there. So that is my learnings from ChatGPT 4, trying to build an admin from scratch, trying to play dumb, and just seeing what this thing is capable of from a high level. So hope that was helpful to all of you, and thanks again for hanging around.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see if there's any questions first, and then I have two. Anybody else?
I don't have any particular questions. I was sorry. I might have cut somebody off. I don't have any particular questions. I was just kind of Googling out there and I found like this React admin tutorial, which kind of goes through a lot of the things that you said. I don't know if it pulled a lot of its answers from that page or other pages. It looks pretty similar. You mentioned about adding a login page and local storage, like that example was on there too. I noticed with this one, there isn't a source code download. There's videos and code that you can copy. So again, I don't know if just trying to figure out like if some of the things are faster to go find something like, I mean, to build a POC, like I would think you could find a React admin tutorial out there. You could just download and get maybe about where you're going. I'm trying to figure out like what's the best use on the engineer side, maybe the Copilot or other things like that. I'm just curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, this was an experiment just to see what it could do without opening up
Sure.
that documentation page at all. And where where I found it was nice was I could just tell it what my API was, like what the format was. And instead of me writing those transformers or those deserializers or anything like that, it could write all of that for me. So that was pretty nice. So any of that boilerplate code that an engineer, like, it's just tedious to write at that point. It's like, hey, here's my JSON actual protocol. Can you just parse this for me and give me a JSON object? Boom, like it can do that for you. That's fantastic. If you get stuck somewhere, I've had engineers get stuck in the past on certain things. And I have a couple great examples of that. GPT has helped them get unstuck. But other than that, it seems like my team is finding a lot of success with Copilot. And for so what I did recently is I had a 2-pane window in Visual Studio. I had a mock data payload in the right tab, and I was writing the parser in the left tab. And as soon as I wrote, because I was going to map some data into an object, as soon as I typed .m, it filled out the map function and completely parsed what was on the right tab in Visual Studio. So Copilot wrote a perfect interpreter for that JSON payload by just hitting .m. It knew I wanted to map these functions into this thing because I had done something similar earlier in the file. So that was pretty cool as well. But if you wanted to write a bunch of boilerplate code for you, unit tests, things like that, this is where I think seasoned engineers are finding a lot of value, not so much doing what I did here today.
In that example, John, was that kind of a multi-line response, or was it kind of completing a line of code, or with the Copilot?
So I was writing JavaScript, and I was actually debugging
Sorry,
something. Oh, so yeah, it's okay. I was debugging something. It wasn't quite parsing something properly, so I just put a sample mock JSON file in my right tab, and I was writing JavaScript on the left tab. And as soon as I started writing the map function, I think one of the tips and tricks with Copilot is if you have it open on a tab, it's going to put it in its context. So that's where it was able to infer what I was working with and write code against it versus if it was versus if it was just a file in the project but it wasn't actually open. I don't know if it would have done it as smoothly. Maybe it would. But I did read that on a blog with Copilot in particular. Have the files you're interested in writing against open, and actual tabs open on your tab bar.
Yeah, definitely. I actually use ChatGPT you mentioned like those one-off tasks. I was trying to find a good example of a factory, kind of like, here's a factory class, here's an interface, here's how you'd register it. So I just asked it to, and it just, generated out me, the interface class, the implementation, and how to register it in the dependency injection. So I think there is a lot, if we get people, if our engineers using that, there's a lot we can get out of that.
Absolutely. And once they figure out how to prompt it correctly to write that, because that's kind of boilerplate again. Like they know in their head abstractly the relationship of these objects and the right design pattern there. But you got to write the interface, you got to write the concrete class, you got to write the tests, you got to write the links and the constructors and the dependency injection, whether you're using a framework or vanilla dependency injection. So if you can have GPT just spin up that 300 lines of code for you, all of that skeleton code, you just saved a lot of time. Now you can move on to what you actually want to write, some of the complex business logic, not a lot of this boilerplate kind of skeleton code.
Yeah, and even the fact that it generated all that, like you said, I didn't have to type all that. I can adjust it. I'm not too worried that it's perfect. It actually did happen to do it fairly well the first try. I put the prompt in there in the chat, and I actually added, even asked it to change it, to say, I wanted to do this also, and so it updated it, and that was just a huge time saver.
Yeah, that's where GPT-4 really impressed me, is it's capable of remembering all the code that it had written in the context, assuming you don't go out of the context, and it can adjust it, fix bugs. It's just incredibly impressive at times. It's mind-blowing at times, and then like I said, it could get stuck, and then you're in trouble other times. But if you prompt it properly, it's a huge time save.
Yeah, I think it's the nature of what it's starting with. I mean, as engineers, and I think engineering is probably one of the areas where this can be so effective, because there is already this huge library of engineers asking questions and giving responses. I think some of the areas where it gets stuck is like, the internet is a big library of right responses, but it's also a big library of wrong responses. So
if I were to guess, ChatGPT is a training exercise in and of itself, where a lot of the engineers are now able to do human validation of correct and incorrect answers. So I'm hopeful that version
Yeah.
5 or 4.5 is going to use the millions and millions of queries on ChatGPT to have the model refined to be even better.
So if they're using it, should they be hitting those like good and the thumbs up, thumbs down? Because
I don't know for sure if it's being trained that way, but I can't imagine it's hurting the model.
Yeah.
I've been selecting thumbs up, thumbs down when it finally gets it right. Sometimes it's the first time, sometimes it's the 5th time. I'm hopeful it'll help, because if it makes us all productive at the end of the day, that's a great thing.
Yeah.
And I've had team members saying Copilot and GPT are making, they're giving me rough guesstimates here, 30% more productive, 40% more productive. Maybe you've heard of these numbers from other engineering leaders as well. In terms of like, do I see that in the numbers in terms of velocity? I think I'm starting to. I think we're starting to see some velocity increases, although that's kind of all relative. But in general, I think pull requests are coming through quicker. They're getting approved quicker. It seems that way. I'm still digging into like code climate and actually looking at hard data to see if that's true. But engineers are telling me they're just feeling more productive. Like, I'm not spending a ton of time writing tests, writing boilerplate code, or getting stuck. Like, I'm trying to write this interpreter, and for some reason this npm package is like erroring out here. When they might have spent 20 minutes searching the web, maybe now they're unstuck in 2 minutes with GPT. So it's all those like micro time saves that are adding up to like a lot of time throughout the week and throughout the sprint.
How would you say about quality?
GPT-4, the quality was great. 3.5, it felt like a glorified Stack Overflow, I guess I would say. But 4 felt like a true like jump in capability, where I would trust 4 to write me. You have to review the code. Don't just blindly trust any code the AI is giving you. But I felt good with the code it was giving me, and I felt like I said before, it was actually starting to split out files and start giving me like a decent design, not like the best design pattern, but it gave me some sort of like project layout instead of just smash everything in your app.js file like GPT-3 was doing. It started splitting files into components, into models, into controllers, into components, and everything was starting to look like an actual project an engineer would write.
Yeah, reading the output I think is critical. My daughter last night was sending me an apology, and she sent it like 3 seconds after she was told to send me an apology, and it was quite verbose. So it was very clear where she got it from. And she wrote, I truly value our relationship, and I am dedicated to being a better daughter with love and sincerity.
As an AI model, I apologize.
Did you give that one a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
I appreciated the diligence. So now that you've learned the process a bit, I guess it's sort of 2 questions. If you were building an admin tool again, would you use 4? And if so, do you have a sense of like how much time that would have saved as opposed to doing it by hand?
For me, it saves time because I don't have the same knowledge my senior software engineers do. Now, if I had tasked that with someone on my team, they would probably do it 5-6 times faster than I would have, and I don't think they would have used GPT-4 the whole time. They probably would have taken a look at the documentation, how these components all actually work with each other, and the proper way of actually doing things, and then using GPT-4 to help them do a lot of that foundational boilerplate stuff and being able to run with that. That's probably the way I'd recommend doing it. Actually understand what you're working with. Don't just blindly start stitching and gluing stuff together. That's how you can get into some trouble. I was just doing that as an experiment, but if I did, and I'm going to continue to use it. So I'm going to add, I think my next part is going to add user login. And as I think Rob mentioned, there's plenty of tutorials out there for user login. But I want to see what GPT-4 can do for me. I know approximately what it should look like. I'm going to tell it what my my gets and my posts look like for logging in or creating a new user or anything like that. And I know I need to store the auth token somewhere, and I know I need to use that auth token for future protected requests. So I'm going to tell it all of that. I'm going to say I need this login. This token needs to be used for those APIs we programmed earlier. build it for me and see what it does. And I'm assuming it's going to give me something pretty close. I'm hopeful. And I think that's going to save me a lot of time from me personally going and reading all of that documentation and building it properly. Because my goal is ultimately to hand this admin off to the proper engineering team. My goal is kind of to give them a head start. So if I can give them a sprint or a 2-sprint head start while they're working on another project, that helps me learn about GPT, helps the team move ahead. And hopefully I'm not going to give them just completely unusable code. The code seems good. They're taking a look at it as I'm writing it, making pull requests, and they're looking at it and say, looks okay, doesn't look terrible. And I'm hopeful they'll be able to carry it forward and making it a true production ready admin.
Gotcha. My other question was, it sounds like you've had pretty good experience with Copilot too. Any sort of general tips from your experience there?
Definitely the tab trick that I read about in
Yep.
a blog and definitely confirmed. That was where I was like, oh wow, it just parsed that whole that mock JSON for me. That was great. Definitely saved me, I don't know, 5 minutes, something like that. But in a second, it was done. I think you could do a / and prompt it. So you could do // write a unit test for the following function, and I believe it'll do that. Outside of that, I'm still learning about it myself, but it seems to be like IntelliSense +++. It's getting my import statements correct. It's removing redundant or unneeded import statements. It's helping me refactor certain pieces of code. It's kind of figuring out what I'm trying to write very early on. If I'm writing a reduce function or a filter function, it's reading what I've done earlier and trying to apply it going forward. And sometimes it gets it right on the head. Sometimes it's just a little off. But even if it's a little off, it's still saving time. So it's writing that 20, 30 lines of code, and all I got to do is change 1 or 2 lines to actually make it do what I'm trying to have it do. And it's been quite nice. I have a feeling that when the next version comes out, I think it's called Copilot X. I think that's where Showtime is going to start. For now, someone doesn't need to go into the GPT environment at all, because I think it's going to use GPT-4, and that's where I think you'll be able to do everything inside of your IDE at that point, and that's where we're going to see the next big productivity jump potentially.
Cool. Any other questions? Listen, I appreciate everybody joining. I appreciate Matt for being willing to take us through your experience.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Do we have time? I was on mute. And
Oh yeah. Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, Matt, you mentioned the importance of the prompts. Have you found any resources that would help train our developers on creating prompts?
I haven't found like I haven't really looked or found like a reliable learning platform, the ones that are out there that have that typically have great computer science learning materials for prompting. I think it's maybe a little too new for experts to be emerging at the time, but just following blogs, Twitter posts, YouTube of like how they're prompting, and how they're typically prompting it is as a blank, do this task with these constraints. So it seems to be like a 3 or 4 phase prompt. So what role is it playing? What task does it need to do? What constraints does it need to have? So you could say things like, as a software developer, I want to do this, and the output should be in JSON. So like that could be like one of the constraints, for example. Outside of that, simpler and more specific, the better. So you can copy and paste error messages into it all day long, kind of like I did. Like, hey, I'm getting this compile error or this interpreter error, and it'll do its best. Sometimes it'll actually figure it out. Sometimes it won't. But if I actually set a breakpoint and I say, no, the query is wrong, the request is wrong, it needs to be like this, and tell it very specifically what it did wrong, it almost always can give you an accurate and correct solution afterwards. So the more specific and directed you can be, the better. The less generic. It's kind of like talking with a real engineer as a product owner. Like when a product owner gives loose requirements in a user story, the ticket almost always doesn't get built properly. But if the user story is extremely specific and the acceptance criteria is dead on, the story has a higher probability chance of actually getting built properly. It's pretty similar here. The more accurate, more detailed the prompt, I think the better results you're going to get.
Yeah, I mean, I did find one resource, but it's more about developing prompts for putting in your application to create features. So you might check it out. I'll put it in the chat there. But you know, for creating prompts for developers to have it write code, yeah, I think that's a different thing. It would be great if there was some kind of resource out there for that to train our developers.
I know GPT just came out with, I forget what they call it, but it's a way to guarantee that like responses are in like a JSON format. So you can actually, I think it's like an extension of LangChain. So like your code can reliably call GPT-4 and get a payload that always is in a specific JSON format. So you can actually pass that response off to a function or a backend call that you wrote, and actually use GPT-4 as part of almost like an API call at that point and chain that data through. I forget what they call the feature, but that's a pretty big one that came out recently.
Yeah, and this course in the link I sent, they do touch on that a little. I'm sure they'll be updating this, you know, as more things evolve. Yeah.
Cool. Well, again, thank you, Matt. Yeah, and I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Have a good one.